Welcome everyone to the May 28th, 2020 Mortgage Quality and Compliance webinar. I'm glad that you can join us. This is Susan Milazzo with the California MBA, and I am of course joined by our chair of the committee, Carol Carson at Plaza Home Mortgage, and our committee co-chair, Raymond Schneitzevold with First Line Compliance. Up on our screen today is our agenda. And we will have a presentation on a legislative update, lots to provide you there, as well as our legal update before we get into our presentation for this month. Just as far as, some opening remarks, I hope that everyone is well and safe and trying to keep our sanity during all this time that we're all experiencing. That the California MBA has been very busy working on both our events going forward this year, but also what has turned out to be an incredibly robust legislative session. As you know, our legislature was out for several weeks due to COVID-19. They came back on May 4th, and it has been a very interesting process dealing with a virtual legislature. So I'd like to go ahead and start us off with our legislative update by Pat Zenzla, our lobbyist, to talk about just a few of the pieces of legislation that we're working on this year. Pat, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Susan. Yes, the legislature is back, and we're going to talk about the accelerated activity on mortgage-related issues, 3 bills specifically. And interestingly, each of the 3 bills that I'm going to talk about are what we would call gut and amends, which means the legislature took a bill dealing with one topic and took all of that language out and inserted a completely new topic into it. And in this case, it's each of these bills are foreclosure or mortgage related. First bill I want to talk about is AB 828. And this bill does a number of things. Most important for our membership is that it would put in place a foreclosure moratorium during the state declared state of emergency related to COVID and for any local government declared state of emergency due to COVID. And the foreclosure moratorium would extend from the time that the state of emergency is put in place until 15 days after it ends. So obviously this is of concern. Specifically, local governments could have state of emergencies that go on for extended periods of time, and then frankly the state of emergency may continue well into this year, possibly into next year in some form, some modified form. So that's just something to be aware of. And then also the foreclosures would not have to pertain specifically to a COVID-related financial crisis or distress as far as the borrower. It's just across the board. And so this bill was amended in the second house, so it is in the Senate, and we're waiting for it to be heard in policy committee in the Senate as it's currently been amended. And we do oppose this bill. The next bill I want to talk about was one that was very recently amended, and this bill is somewhat breathtaking as far as what it would do as far as foreclosure moratoriums and forbearance periods going well beyond where the CARES Act currently goes. Basically, just to summarize, it would put in place a foreclosure moratorium during the state declared state of emergency and for 100 days following the end of the state of emergency. So it would go well beyond the actual time frame that the state of emergency is in place. It would also, at the request of the borrower, put in place a mandatory 180-day forbearance period, and then allow the borrower after the first 180 days, as long as they, within 30 days of the ending of that period, request a second 180 days, you would have mandated 180 days. It's not up to, by the way, it's a 180 period. for each of those timeframes. And then it would also have a mandated 180-day forbearance period in instances where a borrower is 60 days delinquent. So the borrower wouldn't even have to ask for the forbearance. Just if they were 60 days delinquent, the provisions would go into place. There are a number of other requirements, including the servicer having to provide payment options, alternative payment options, et cetera, on the mortgage if after the forbearance periods end, the borrower is determined to not be able to continue to make payments. So modifications and modified payments would have to be offered to the borrower. And then just finally, the other thing I just want to mention is that the penalties for any violation of the requirements are extensive. A couple of examples: a violation would be considered to be Business and Professions Code 17200, unfair and deceptive practice, which has been the source of a great deal of frivolous litigation directed at mortgage servicers and other businesses. Also, any violation of the requirements would create a situation where the servicer would forfeit the rights to commence foreclosure. Obviously that would be of great concern to mortgage servicers and to investors. And then for intentional violations or reckless or willful misconduct, you have the court may award greater of treble damages or $50,000 in statutory damages. So some real significant penalties involved in this bill. Once again, this was a gut and amend. It has passed out of policy committee and it's set for appropriations committee next week. And then Susan, the final bill. I'm sorry.
Yeah, before we move on, can I just make a note while we're still on the slide? Yesterday afternoon, the California MBA, we've been working with a large number of industry partners to oppose this measure. Yesterday, we sent out a Mortgage Action Alliance call to action. And so I would ask anybody who's joined us today that's in the state of California, please visit the MA website. If you don't have that information, you can email me, susan@cmba.com. I'll send it to you. But we ask that you take part in our Mortgage Action Alliance call to action. And you can, gives you a summary of the bill. And with a couple of clicks, you can be sending a communication to your representative on our state assembly. As Pat indicated, it's already passed banking committee. It should be heard in appropriations committee next week, we're assuming, and then it'll be fast tracked to the floor. So we really need everybody's help in defeating this measure, and that's a way you can be a part of our advocacy effort. So just wanted to give everybody a plug for Mortgage Action Alliance and taking part in this. Thanks, Pat.
Sure. And then the final bill I wanted to update folks on, SB 1447. This bill was amended and not as problematic as far as changes, much more reasonable changes. Basically what this bill would do would amend the Homeowner Bill of Rights in California to extend those protections to foreclosures of residential 1 to 4 rental properties. So not just owner occupied, but now to residential 1 to 4 rental properties. So that would be a little bit of an expansion of what's covered by the Homeowner Bill of Rights. And those provisions would stay in place until January 1st, 2023. It also creates some cleanup changes to some provisions that deal with foreclosure consultants to help prevent against fraud in those areas. So those are the 3 bills that I wanted to highlight for folks. Susan, thank you.
Great, thanks, Pat, and thank you for all of the work that you do on behalf of the industry. It is nothing short of a Herculean effort this year. There's a lot going on in a very condensed time period. So stay tuned for more information on future webinars about what's happening from a legislative perspective in California. Thanks, Pat. So next, I'd like to turn it over to our General Counsel for the California MBA, Michael Pfeiffer with Kirby and McGuinn. He's going to give us our litigation update on the Perez versus MERS case. Michael, I can turn it over to you.
Thank you, Susan. Before I start, I just wanted to also echo Susan's comments about the Mortgage Action Alliance and tell anybody who hasn't used it before how easy it is to use. I went on there yesterday afternoon, was able to send out a letter in opposition to that state legislation. They have it set up so nicely. They have pre-drafted letters. You can modify them as you want and basically click and boom, the letter goes out. It's the easiest thing in the world, and it creates a volume that is what people count. So I just wanted to echo your comments, Susan. To get on to the litigation update, this is the case Perez v. MERS. Some of you may have heard about it. You may have heard different things about it. But from my perspective, this is a huge decision. It's not binding on the state of California, but it's binding. But it lends the credence of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals to this issue, and we've been fighting this issue and dealing with this issue for almost a decade. And as you'll see as I go through it, basically the issue is California going to stay a non-judicial foreclosure state, or is it going to become a judicial foreclosure state? And is it going to allow the kinds of challenges to foreclosures that turn a non-judicial process into a litigation every time someone seeks to foreclose? This decision, the effect of this decision is to say, no, we're going to stick with the non-judicial. So how did the case arise? Well, basically, they were husband and wife homeowners who owned two California properties, one in West Sacramento and the other in San Pablo. The deed of trust for the Perez 1 property identified Dollar Mortgage Corp as the lender and MERS as the beneficiary for Dollar and its successors and assignments. The deed of trust for Perez 2 identified American Mortgage Express as the lender and MERS as the beneficiary, and for both AMEC and its successors and assignments. Next slide. The Perez 1 loan was sold 4 times back in 2005, 2006, and believe it or not, we are still litigating issues going all the way back to 2005 and 2006. It's shocking, but I have 3 cases that are still dealing with the fallout from that. And this one is one that's on appeal. I wasn't involved in this case. One of our legal issues committee chairman was involved, Ian Rambaran, and kudos to him. I don't know if he's on the call or not, but the Perez 2 loan was sold 3 times and eventually owned by Bank of New York Mellon. In 2009, a notice of default and the notice of trustees were issued on the Perez 1 loan, and because they didn't make payments, they scheduled a foreclosure sale, but it never took place. And there was no foreclosure activity ever initiated on the Perez 2 loan. That's a fact that is not easily noticed, but when you get down to the opinion, you see that they cite that fact. So apparently they never even issued a notice of default on the second loan. I don't know if the 2 loans were linked together or not, but the homeowners filed 2 actions, one on each one of the loans in California Superior Court against the banks, challenging their authority to foreclose and seeking declaratory relief, cancellation of instruments, and quiet title. Next slide. Basically, what they were asking the courts to do were to declare that the banks had no legal rights in the underlying notes or deeds of trust, and that they did not have authority to collect mortgage payments or initiate foreclosure proceedings. That goes to the heart of the foreclosure process. If you don't have authority, if you have no interest in the notes, how do you get to foreclose? And it targets the essence of realization of lenders' security. So it's a very lethal challenge. They sought the borrowers, interestingly, of course, they never just want a halfway measure. They sought unencumbered title to their properties and permanent injunctions to prevent the banks from collecting mortgage payments or foreclosing. In other words, they wanted the loans completely removed from their properties. Free home. The claims were based on alleged defects in the assignments of the underlying deeds of trust, such that the banks never received any beneficial interest in the loans. And it's not clear from the opinion where the homeowners were claiming who owned the loans, or if they even made an effort to do that. They were, because I don't think Dollar is around anymore. I don't know about AMEC, but bottom line is, the homeowners were saying, we just want a free home. We don't want any loans on it, and we think that the assignments were defective, so therefore the people who are foreclosing now don't have authority to do this. And if they don't have authority, then they can't collect payments, and they can't foreclose. Cases were removed to the U.S. District Court from the Northern District, basically San Francisco area, and the District Court said, sorry, you haven't stated a plausible claim for relief under California law. So they appealed to the Ninth Circuit. Next slide. The court discussed all the key cases that are on this, basically saying that the California Supreme Court had not directly answered the question. It referred to the Yavanova case, which we were involved in as a CMBA. We actually filed an amicus brief in that case. And the borrowers had, in that case, the California Supreme Court said borrowers had standing to challenge prior assignments of the note in a post-foreclosure suit if they alleged assignments were void. They were basically saying that it was, the court there said that foreclosure process has such a dramatic effect on borrowers that they have standing. But they limited their holding, or they didn't necessarily limit it, but they held only that on the facts of that case, and those applied only to a post-foreclosure lawsuit. In this case, the court said that the Supreme Court had not decided the issue, and so they moved on, and then they relied on intermediate California law. By the way, a federal court in deciding issues of state law has to look to the law of the state, and Ninth Circuit, of course, is a federal court. So they looked at intermediate court decisions, the Gomes case and the Jenkins case, both of which we've discussed over the years and have dealt with in the Legal Issues Committee. And they basically relied on the holdings in those cases, and they rejected a suggestion in a case called Brown v. Deutsche Bank National Trust that the Supreme Court would eventually extend the Yavanova to pre-foreclosure actions. Instead, the Ninth Circuit said no. Go ahead, next slide, please. There's no convincing evidence that the Supreme Court would break with the intermediate court precedent, and California law does not permit preemptive actions to challenge a party's authority to pursue foreclosure before foreclosure has taken place. Because no foreclosures have taken place, such suits are preemptively challenge the bank's authority are not allowed under California law. They cannot be permitted. And so, as I say, this preserves, for now at least, California's comprehensive non-judicial scheme of foreclosures, and it blunts efforts to undermine it and the possibility of lawsuits filed solely for the purpose of delaying valid foreclosures. For those of you involved in any way in servicing, this is a dramatic success, and even if you're not, it'll dramatically affect your costs of doing business, so in a positive way. So next slide, that's it. That's my presentation, Susan.
Great, Michael. Thank you. Gosh, that was a significant piece of case law there, and I appreciate you, bringing that to our attention for purposes of our committee here today. I wanted to now turn us over to our committee chair, Carol Carson. And Carol, if you would like to introduce our speakers, we can start with our presentation for today.
Thanks so much, Susan. And hello, everybody. We are really excited about today's feature presentation. It's an update and sort of hot topics on the mortgage fraud front from two incredibly good speakers, and let me tell you who they are. We have Doug LeDoux, who is director of Freddie Mac's Single Family Fraud Risk Unit. He manages the investigation team and the Freddie Mac exclusionary list. His team investigates mortgage fraud schemes, makes resolution recommendations, such as the exclusionary list additions and removals, and assists regulatory and law enforcement agencies. Before he was with Freddie, Doug had received a Bachelor of Science in Business Management and started out in the title insurance industry. He also had quite quite a varied career. He's been a small business owner, city planning commissioner, and a city councilman. And he also attended the police academy and performed criminal investigations in title insurance and escrow fraud for the Utah Insurance Fraud Division and Utah's Federal Mortgage Fraud Task Force. He has been in this investigative role for about 18 years, so he's sort of probably knows what he's talking about. Our other distinguished speaker is Sean Sowards. He is the director, Fannie Mae's director of mortgage fraud investigations. He is responsible for overseeing operations of Fannie Mae's mortgage fraud program and ensuring compliance with applicable Bank Secrecy Act laws and regulations. He serves as Fannie Mae's liaison with industry, regulatory, and law enforcement partners with respect to mortgage fraud matters. Sean, previous experience was 25 years in law enforcement, retiring a few years ago as director of field operations for criminal investigation for the division of for the IRS. Prior to the IRS, he was also a special agent with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, Office of Inspector General. Mr. Sowards has a Bachelor of Arts in Econ from UVA and is a certified fraud examiner. So with that introduction, gentlemen, we're honored to have you with us, and it is on your plate now. Please tell us everything.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. Yeah, thanks for the introduction. Doug and I will kind of alternate going through a deck that we've prepared just to kind of give you some insights into what we're seeing in the mortgage fraud space, what the trends are looking like, and spend a little bit of time focusing on the issues that are prevalent in California, of course, and finally kind of talk about the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on potential concerns with mortgage fraud. So I have the honors to have the first slide, which kind of just gives an overview. And these slides are generally presented on Fannie Mae's website, so you can kind of access them at any time. But I like to kind of show the distribution of the source of the mortgage fraud allegations that we get. This has been a pretty consistent picture for us for quite a while, which is a good picture because it shows really good engagement, from our lender partners. Lender self-reports for fraud in origination and servicing spaces are the overwhelming majority of the source of the tips that we get, which is good news. We encourage everybody to continue to send those our way. Of course, REO is a little bit different. As expected, consumers are the primary driving source of those tips coming in. And also, I'll say if and Doug, I don't know if you have a perspective on it, but if you guys have questions at any point through this, the moderators or anybody listening, feel free to raise a hand or let us know. Next slide, please. And so I told you, the sources of the cases that we get. These are the findings of those cases. The dark blue here represents the percentage of cases in which fraud was found. That's the percentage of the cases we investigated. Kind of the lighter blue color is where we had no fraud found. And the orange color is NA. Really what that means is, we received tips. However, Fannie Mae didn't have any exposure or risk associated with that allegation. So we just had no finding and closed that out. NA. Something to highlight here, and this is for 18 and 19, the full years. It's pretty consistent. About 67, 68% of the cases we investigate result in a fraud finding. Updated, though, information is so far this year, 2020 year to date, those findings have increased to about 73%. So we're seeing a little greater percentage of fraud contained in the allegations that we're receiving. It's hard to say exactly why that is, what's driving that. It could just be, increased diligence on the part of the lender community, giving us more robust tips to investigate could also indicate an uptick in the occurrence of fraud in the mortgage industry. So something that we're monitoring. Next slide, please. It's kind of in the same vein. This kind of shows over time, 2015 through 2019, how our findings have changed. And there's been a significant increase in the percentage of fraud we found in the cases that we investigate. Certainly from 2015 and 16, some of that has to do with improvement of our skill set, improvement of our resources, and tools that we have to investigate the fraud. Certainly, I think that shows improvement in our capabilities, but I think it also does show more engagement from our lender partners and potentially an uptick in the occurrence of mortgage frauds. Next slide. So this is a depiction of the types of fraud that we found in those cases where we found fraud for 2018 and 2019, and kind of showing a comparison between those two. Liabilities fraud, occupancy fraud, income fraud leading the way, and significantly higher in 19 than it was in 18. Forgery, we see a lot. It's consistent. And then employment fraud is hand in hand with income fraud. We usually find those generally together. And again, asset fraud as well have all kind of increased. And the things that we've seen, I would add that income and employment fraud are something we see substantially in California. Next slide. Finally, I'll let you get Doug do some talking.
Thank you. So you guys have noticed this is a little different format where we're going back and forth. We're trying to cover topics. Instead of having you listen to each one of us repeat each other, we're going to try to interject like this. So I'm going to focus a little bit more just to give a different perspective on sort of case level investigations. But I know these interesting facts that Sean has shown us are so relevant. So I chose not to include those slides because theirs are pretty comprehensive, but I do want to address that a little bit. Similar to what Sean mentioned, most of our actionable or fraud findings do come from our seller services. The counterparties are really effective, and it's difficult to tell, as he mentioned, trends of those reports because or at least it's hard to know if it's because there's more fraud or because we're getting more effective reporting or whatever, because they come primarily from our customers. But probably 75 to 80% of our actionable referrals or actions we take are resulting from referrals from our customers. So great partnership there. So I'm glad he brought that out. I wanted to show you this. So at the loan level, I mentioned I'll talk about case level later on, but just this slide here at the loan level just shows the kind of categories of fraud we're seeing. And as you see on that top bar, consistently the size of those segments are consistently largest for the undisclosed non-mortgage debt. That's been for quite some time the most common deficiency or fraud finding we have in the loans we reviewed. And I took this from not fraud-related quality control reviews, but just their baseline sampling of loans that they're reviewing. So undisclosed non-mortgage debt is consistently by far number one. We do talk a lot about, when we were in fraud seminars and discussions, about occupancy and employment. So certainly those are things that are top of mind for everybody. But as you see on the second, third, and fourth bar, those three items kind of are always there and consistently across the time. Occupancy misrep, sometimes that's a difficult one to really determine, right? But that's been consistently part of one of our findings. And then borrowers not employed at closing. We may talk about that a little bit later with COVID stuff, but even historically, that has been a very common finding for our QC reviews. So income and employment are always, of course, critical, but always present. and occupancy. So I wanted to mention that. As far as tips, sources and things, I didn't bring a slide for this, but I thought I'd give you a little bit of a flavor for some things. We've noticed in the last couple of years, our money laundering referrals that contain money laundering allegations have been a significant source of referrals. I don't know if that's again because there's more focus on that, or if it's more prevalent. Some of our cases do include a lot of money laundering elements, but that's been a significant source of the referrals we get do have that allegation. I also thought I'd just mention, as far as volumes, we've had a consistent, I compared before the meeting today, I went and looked and compared the first 4 months of this year with the first 4 months of last year. And interesting drop off in the last couple of months. I don't know if Sean, if you've seen that, but we've had the referrals coming in have dropped off significantly in the last since March, April. So that's, we can draw our own conclusions, I guess, as to that. But other than that, it's been fairly consistent over the last couple of years. I know people are interested in this fraud on the rise. We always talk about fraud being a fairly low incidence of fraud, low fraud environment, but is it coming back? When's it coming back? So that's always the question we get. But the last few years, and we'll see some slides, I think Sean's even got some that show very consistent and low, but and that confirmed. I even looked at some of the SAR filings that we do. As you all know, that we have to file SARs on so many things, and the SAR filings over the last few years have also been consistent. So that gives you a feel just for what we're seeing. This is the only slide I brought for this kind of statistics, so I'm gonna, sorry Sean, but you're up next again. But I just wanted to at least touch on what we're seeing, how often we're seeing, and now we'll go into a little bit more of a longer term trending analysis. So go ahead and go to the next slide.
Thanks, Doug. So this kind of gives a picture, long-term picture of fraud findings by vintage of the loans. No surprise, the significant spike in 2007 with the last crisis that we endured, and then a big drop off. And when you look at it with the perspective of 2007, fraud is low. It does remain low. It's a small percentage of our total acquisitions, and it continues to remain kind of in that state. But if we go to the next slide, it kind of condenses the view a little bit, and it shows kind of a steady increase from 2011, kind of plateauing in 15 and 16 and into the present. And again, the drop off for 19 isn't really reflective of a drop off in fraud. It's just reflective of a drop off in the lag between origination and then identification of the fraud itself. So I expect, when we get to the end of this year, 19 will look a lot like 18. So, while overall it's relatively low as a percentage of all of the loans that are originated, and certainly as a percentage of the acquisitions that we have, when you kind of shrink the perspective a little bit, there is a bubble. We are seeing plenty of it. Maybe we're getting better at finding it and investigating it and reporting it out. But that's something that I think is worth at least noting, even though I think the overall fraud risk remains relatively pretty low. I don't know, Doug, if you agree.
I do agree. In fact, before we go on to the next slide, could you go back one? I'd like to talk, this slide you have is interesting with this peak here. I did a similar analysis. I'm actually glad you included this, because I went back to look to see what it looked like before the crisis back then, to see if, what were the leading indicators and how you know if it's coming back again. And this is interesting. You see this peak at 2007. Obviously, there's a lag from when the fraud occurs, when it's reported and all those things. But on the left side of that peak, so if you look back, at least on our drawing, I wish I'd have brought it, but if you look back to 2001, 2, 3, 4 to see what it was like leading into those indicators, it looks the same as it does on the right side of this graph that he has for 2011, 12, 13. It really is pretty flat on both sides. You don't see this sort of 45-degree angle spike until you get into some of these bad loans. So relative both sides of the peak, it's pretty similar. So this is a very effective graphic to show everyone has that perspective, right? What's it like compared to the bad times? Well, it's significantly different. But as you zoomed in on your next slide, you see within that low peak, there are some changes. But yeah, it does seem very low. So look, go to the next slide, and I'll show you what we did as a similar analysis to what he did, only we did with a case pattern analysis. And what I wanted to show you on this was that we have, you know, one-off loans. A lot of the stats we report, at least, are on the loan level misrep, single loans. But I wanted to look at kind of at the case level, because that would indicate sort of a more organized effort to commit fraud. And so if we have a pattern in a set of circumstances, we'll actually open an investigation case. We don't do that for every, obviously, referral that comes in. But as you see, this chart shows the number of cases opened by quarter, and going back to 15. So giving you kind of a 3-4 year period, I guess 5-year period, of what are our cases, again, indicating there's actually an organized structure, not just one-off loans. It's pretty sporadic. It certainly does look sporadic, but I put this trend line in there. You see that peak in fourth quarter of 16, that we had some appraisal matters that really jumped that up. But typically, or other than that, you see this slow increase in organized, patterns of fraud occurring from over the last 5 years. So since that's a question we often ask, I wanted just to address that and show you that, yeah, it is low. And compared to that slide we showed before, it's much lower than it was in 6, 7, 8, 9 in those years. But it's slowly creeping back, and we do see more organized efforts. And the other thing I wanted just to mention is that when I look at the cases that we're investigating, they're getting, although the numbers are not significantly increasing, each case is becoming more robust. There are more loans included in a case, an organized case, than there were 2 years ago. And we're getting a larger number of individuals involved in those cases. Many of you know we have the exclusionary list, so I look at the cases and how many people that we think are culpable to the scheme that might end up on our exclusionary list, and the numbers per case are also increasing. So although the number of tips isn't significantly going up, and the number of cases isn't really dramatically increasing, they're becoming more robust and more individuals involved. So that's what this slide is meant to show. You can go on to the next slide. And I don't know if we want to ask if there's been any questions submitted. Are people able to submit questions as we go? Do we want to?
Yes, actually we do. We do have a set of questions, and I know that when we had chatted about setting up the webinar, you were fine to take some questions during it. So I do have a question. What about instances of wire transfer fraud? So some sort of fraud where the down payments or the loans are being kind of hijacked at the last minute. Either of you seeing, what are you seeing in that activity?
Well, I'll just take a shot at answering that, and then Sean, you can take it. I don't know that I've seen a trending pattern. We have had a larger number of those over the last couple of years that, I don't know that a few years ago we didn't see quite as much of that. So yes, we've seen increases in those, but not dramatically to where I'd say it's even could put a percentage to that. I don't know if you've seen what you've seen, Sean, but that's what we've seen.
Yes. Similarly, lately I haven't seen very much of it. Most of what we see is usually caught before the bad guys are able to abscond with the money. Usually it's somebody identifies a suspicious email with wiring instructions. They identify it before they act upon it. And so I think the education efforts have worked really well. Most people are very aware of this potential fraud, are educating the borrowers, educating the settlement attorneys and agencies to ensure that they're on the lookout for it. So I've actually seen a decline, if anything, in that type of fraud, at least to the extent that we're seeing it, at Fannie Mae. So I think overall, that is that's generally and broadly good news.
And just a reminder, if any of you have questions as Doug and Sean are going along, you can type them in the questions dialog box, and we will get to those.
Also, I just want to mention, so at the end of this, we have our emails. You know, for me at least, if you're seeing something different than what we're talking about, for example, if you're seeing a lot more of that kind of activity, and whether you want to talk about it here or not, but certainly send us. I'd be interested to see, because I think we've seen the same thing. A lot of the reports we get are things that were stopped. But if you're seeing something different, send us an email and let us know, because either we can look at things more tightly, or also just be interesting for us to know what's happening out there. So we appreciate the communication.
Yeah, I
So
echo that. Yep. So
did you have other questions,
forward,
or should we go on? Sorry.
Yeah. Are we good to go on?
Yeah, you are good. That's the question, yes.
Okay. All right, thanks. So this slide just shows the findings type, by vintage of the loans. It's really meant to kind of show, how the types of fraud have changed, over a period of time, from credit liabilities, back during the crisis. Now the predominant findings that we're having on our fraud cases are with income and liabilities, and closely connected to income is employment fraud. That spike in occupancy fraud really was around just a couple of really big cases. Primarily, the trend has been towards income and liabilities, but income and employment being kind of the new player in the fraud that we're seeing, at least in the last few years. Doug, I don't know if that's consistent with what you've been seeing at Freddie or not, but that's certainly our perspective.
Yep, that's definitely right.
And then the next slide just kind of shows you where this fraud is taking place, 18 to 19, and kind of what that change has looked like. I love California. Hope to someday live in California, but there certainly is plenty of mortgage fraud taking place in California, leading the nation in terms of regional findings. It's the #1 state for mortgage fraud, and at 23%, with a significant increase from 2018 to 2019. I think Doug has some similar data to share with you.
You can go to the next slide. I do. I actually like these slides, because that's, for us, this is based on cases, not just, so this would not be reported loans with misrep, but actual cases that we've opened, just to give you a different perspective as well. And you can see California, and if we had Razzie Awards, you guys win, right? Because you have, it's really dramatic. We have almost half of our cases there. So sorry, sorry to report that, but that's what we see. It used to be, I don't know, Sean, if you've seen this as well, but well, I guess on your slide it shows, and I suppose those are more of a loan level picture, but it's much more even between like Florida, New York, California. So you see that here in yours, California, like in 19, it shows 23%, whereas over in the Southeast, you have 20. And we used to see that case-wise as well, where it was kind of spread that way. In fact, our team, we have well, now everyone's at home, but we used to have a team in Virginia and a team in California, investigative team, and so they would kind of cover half the country each. Now it's really weighted towards California because of that. There are other cases that I kind of stopped it at 5%. So we have some Oregon, Washington, Arizona, other places. We had one in Minnesota the other, a while back, which is kind of unusual. You don't see many Wyoming cases or Montana, but there's California, certainly percentage. And those are, I think, I'm trying to think of the cases we have there, primarily all employment and income. I believe that's the situation. So I don't know what it is out there, but that's what we see as far as distribution. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So we're going to start talking a little bit more about trends now, what we're seeing now. I brought this slide up because some of you maybe have read some of these articles that we put out. We're trying to get a way to communicate what we're seeing throughout the year, rather than just as we do these sort of annual conferences, various conferences. So I just put these up for some examples of what we were showing last year. So you see the false college transcripts, the fake employers. I think you all remember obviously those alerts that Fannie put out on the fake employers. And then we had, we're seeing a lot of pay stub stuff. So those are all consistent with the employer stuff that we've been talking about, different variations of schemes, I guess, activities. And then we included this reverse occupancy. We still see that. Those are a little more difficult to spot. In some cases, they're marginalized, whether they're actually a fraud or they're just kind of getting in between the gaps in guides. But those are the trends that we talked about last year. They still continue, but if you go to the next slide, you'll see the things that we're talking about sort of now this year. Of course, COVID changes everything. And first, when we were asked to do this, I thought, well, no one's going to care about what's happened before. Now everyone just cares about what's going to happen now because the world's changed. But we still want to show you what we're seeing. So we put out an article a while back on the faked benefits, the VA letters and the Social Security Administration letters, where they're falsifying those documents, those letters to show income streams. Also, a big one that we're seeing, and I don't know if you're seeing this, Sean, but we have a lot of cases involving falsified CPA letters. And I don't know that I'd seen that, other than the last couple of years. Either they weren't spotting it before, or they just weren't happening. But a lot of where you're getting a CPA letter that's been forged or falsified. And then another one I just threw in there because I think it's interesting along the lines of the college transcripts is the divorce decrees, valid divorce decrees that have been modified again to show income streams. So those are some things that we'll be talking about. We're introducing in our conversations this year. They're starting to pick up. We've got a few cases on each one of those as far as schemes. I might just mention at this time, if any of you are on this call and you're not getting copies of these articles we send out, you can send us an email and I'll get you on the distribution so you can get those. And we do those every couple of months throughout the year. So I was going to go on to COVID stuff, but Sean, I don't know if you want to talk about anything else before we get to COVID, or should we just continue?
No, I just wanted to really concur with what you just were sharing in terms of the fraud trends, that you're seeing, and really specifically, from what we're seeing in California, the employment and income fraud is pretty significant. Things, to look out for, red flags there are, income really isn't commensurate with the profession or position that they're reporting, significantly above the median for that type of profession in that area, even numbered salary amounts, deposits in their bank accounts not supporting the reported income, manual employment verification required, recent promotion or change of income, and we're seeing a lot of kind of combined with that significant gift funds being used as down payments that are difficult to source. That's really the trend that we're seeing. If those kind of flags come up, I think it pays to start asking more questions and digging a little bit deeper on those type of issues. So I just wanted to share that a little bit of perspective.
I'm glad you did, because that reminded me of something else I wanted to say. So before we go into COVID, I'll just echo something. Is first off, the gift funds. We went back one time and looked at sort of our cases historically to see what kind of elements we saw in a couple of years of cases. Gift funds was there very consistently. Not that gift funds are a problem, but all the cases, or many of the cases, had an element of gift fund problems with them. And so that was, I think you mentioned that, and I thought that was significant because that's a difficult situation, difficult thing to source, but they're so often part of the cases that we have. I also wanted just to mention one last thing, because you kind of touched on this too, is of all these different things we talk about, the thing that we notice is the question we always get is, well, how do I find these? You tell us about these schemes and the trends. Well, how do I find them so that I can avoid them? And I don't know if you'd agree with this, Sean, but what I see is a lot of times the profile, and each loan is different, but the profile of the borrower often doesn't fit what they're representing. So like, for example, somebody who just got out of college but has a lot of money in the bank, that seems, now it could happen, but that seems like it's inconsistent. So the details of what you would expect for a certain borrower, how much they make or how long they've been employed at a position, doesn't always, or often doesn't fit the facts that they're submitting for qualification. So that's a
Totally
generalized
agree.
statement, but I see that so often, and I think, is it possible in our automated world to step back and say something doesn't smell right? That's always kind of the thing, right? If it doesn't smell right, you look at it. So you brought that up, and I'm glad you did, because that's consistent.
Agreed.
Okay, before we go into COVID, any questions we want to answer? We've only got about 5 or so minutes left, but is there anything?
You know, just a question. Why? I mean, any thoughts on why there's such a great percentage of fraud in our beautiful state?
Well, that's a tricky question. That feels like I don't know if I want to answer. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. A lot of people, a lot of volume.
Is it relative to how many, like the percentage of loans that are generated here? Like, where there's just by sheer volume, we have more here. So could that be a contributing factor? I'm wondering.
So that's got to be part of it.
Yeah, I would say that that's certainly part of it. Population and amount of activity is going to drive that. I think, you know, the other thing I think is worth highlighting is, you know, these, for the most part, the fraud loans are performing. So there's false income, there's false employment, but somehow those loans continue to perform. So there must be some source of income that's supporting those borrowers that they aren't willing to report, don't want to report. I don't know. This is just speculation. So maybe there's more non-traditional sources of income in certain parts of the country that are driving that. But that's purely speculation. I have no data.
Interesting.
To validate that.
Does seem right.
I just don't know.
A lot of the cases, the income is just it's undocumentable. You know, it's different kinds of different sources, and so that I also wonder if, you know, if cost of living, you know, it's difficult. People are trying all they can do to qualify. So it's really fraud for housing. And he said ours are the same thing. It's performing, so it could be that. And maybe in California, you're just all overachievers. Even the fraudsters are overachievers. I don't know. Silver I don't know.
You say you want to live here because you don't, but go ahead.
So we don't have much time left. Just wanted to maybe cover COVID. So I made a list here of some things we've been thinking about, looking at, not to suggest all of these we anticipate schemes will increase dramatically with these. But I actually thought if you could go to the next slide, Sean has actually a better slide than I did. So you see it's kind of the same things, but there's a little more detail. So I thought it might be easier to look at that, especially in our short time period. It does go into some of the things we're concerned about. And I don't know if Rod or Sean, you can talk about whether your feeling is whether they're going to be a big rush of schemes. We're not really expecting that, but there'll be some of these. But these are some good descriptions here.
Yeah, I'm not concerned about a huge influx of schemes based on the current pandemic, based on a few factors. You know, when we started to kind of try and project, well, what do we expect to see coming out of this? We kind of used, you know, the prior crisis, the housing crisis, as our lens. But the market's very different today than it was then. The quality of the loans is much better. You know, the cause of this crisis, you know, isn't housing. It's not, you know, subprime, you know, lending and mortgage. It's something completely different. And so it's really hard to, you know, expect that we'll see the same types of frauds coming out of it. So on this list, you know, the forbearance side, you know, I don't think there's really any fraud to be, you know, ferreted out here, just because, you know, per the law, all you have to do is verbally say, I have a hardship because of COVID, and you are entitled to a forbearance. So there's nothing there for us to investigate or to call out as being fraudulent. You know, the thing that I most worry about, and I don't know if Doug, you agree, is, you know, borrowers being victims, you know, in times like this. Fraudsters always take advantage of a crisis to try and prey on, you know, fearful, you know, victims. So borrowers being contacted by fraudsters posing to be from Freddie, from Fannie, from the servicer, promising, you know, to lower their mortgage payments, to defer their mortgage payments, usually in exchange for some kind of an upfront advance fee, is something that I expect we'll see an uptick in. things to look at, especially if you're in the servicing space. These fraudsters generally are pretty good at getting enough information about the borrowers to call the servicer posing as the borrower to get detailed information on their loan. Then they can take that information, call the borrower posing as the servicer, and sound credible. They have a lot of specific and accurate information about their loan. It makes them more likely to trust these fraudsters calling in. So that's what I think we're most worried about seeing. I haven't seen that yet. I haven't seen a big spike in that, but that's something that I'm concerned about coming down the line. On the flexibilities for appraisals and appointment verifications, given the situation we're in now, I think there are other ways to validate these. I don't see any significant value issues. It is harder to verify employment. As you guys probably know, it's harder for us to investigate employment fraud for the same reasons, but there are also ways that you can do it that are still effective. And since hopefully this is a temporary reprieve, a temporary flexibility, this shouldn't be a long-term issue for us to be concerned about. And then just, that last bullet, just as, potentially some, as financial stresses come into play, that usually drives bad behavior, drives potentially risky behavior and fraud. So it's just something to look out for as folks get under stress. I'm looking for ways to stay solvent and to find money. So Doug, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, you said it well. I specifically would just underline our same thing as our concern is really the borrower scams. We expect those will happen, once this all gets going on, and those are so nefarious. It's so damaging to borrowers. But we do, of all the risks, that's probably the top. We're all monitoring for these other things to see what happens, but those are the ones that I think we most expect to be high and hurtful, damaging. So, but no, you said it well. Thank you.
We did get one question that came in relative to COVID, if I may share that with you. What about the borrower that requests forbearance just in case their job is affected by COVID sometime in the future? Is that considered fraud? Is that not something you're monitoring? Because as I think Sean had pointed out, there's the language of the law doesn't really require you to demonstrate anything.
Yeah. We initially thought that would be an issue. But once the way the laws came out, it really turns out to where it's like you said, it's so easy to get them that we thought that would be the case. But the way the CARES Act came out, it's difficult to find fraud in some of those, even if they don't have a hardship and they say it. All they have to do is say it. So we still track it and monitor it. But
and then we have to look forward to potential loan modification fraud issues.
Yeah, at the other end.
Those programs exist. They do require folks to demonstrate, means and assets and so forth. And so there could potentially be fraud there, but that won't be anything different than we've seen in the past.
Right.
Well, I want to thank you both for joining us. That was great information, and I truly appreciate you being available to provide us that update. If just to reiterate, if any of you have a question for Sean or Doug, you can type it in the questions dialog box, and we can get to that here in just a moment. So I'll give people a few minutes to see if they have any questions for us. Seeing anything coming in? I'm still looking here. Perhaps we've done a good job of asking or answering any questions. Anything, Carol, Raymond, do you have any other comments or questions for our speakers? I think you guys gave us some really great information, especially in kind of what you were kind of looking at as far as COVID-19. I think that was really really very interesting. So we'll conclude today's webinar with just some information about next month's featured topic. We're going to be talking about ADA website compliance, and we have a representative from User First, which is a vendor that works on website compliance. Of course, our counsel, Michael Pfeiffer, will be talking about, I think, litigation that he's experienced in that area. And then we have the Chief Marketing Officer at Plaza Home Mortgage that'll talk about branding and some of the tips for lenders that they can use to ensure that they have, their website is compliant. So if you are not receiving our MQAC notifications and would like to be added to our email distribution list, you can email me at susan@cmba.com. I will be happy to get you added. And that concludes today's webinar. I appreciate everybody joining us, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks for having us. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Take care.
everybody.